Let's turn to Josh Walker. He's a Middle East security expert at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
So clearly a very complicated situation, to say the least, in Syria. The Russian air campaign has been going on for 2 weeks now. Explain to us, in your thoughts, if anything has been accomplished during this 2 weeks.
I think the only thing that's been accomplished is complicating things far more than they needed to be. Adding this international crisis in terms of the possibility of another Cold War, another major conflict between these major powers, complicates an already difficult situation. It's been 4 years of the Syrian civil war. Weighing in on the side of Assad, has already made this even more complicated. And as you mentioned, Turkey is getting even more complicated, even more difficult with the attacks on Saturday as well.
Well, here's what the Russians are saying. They're saying the U.S. strategy did not work. They tried to get rid of ISIL. A year later, ISIL is very much, it's still very operational in Syria. Russia says it can do better and it can go after all the terrorists. Doesn't Moscow have a point here?
I mean, certainly Moscow has a point in the sense that there's no coherent strategy on Syria right now. Syria has become a proxy war, and Russia is simply playing into that. So if you're going to protect Assad and begin to find some way of fighting, you would think the Russians would join with the West in taking on ISIL, but most of their targets have not been ISIL. They've been targeting rebel forces, which even more complicates the civil war going on. This is not about one faction versus another. This is not just ISIL versus Assad. There are other factions as well, including the Kurds.
So why can't the Russians and the Americans sit down, work together, and target the common enemy they have? ISIL is a common enemy for both.
That was the hope in many ways. And when you think of what the U.S. and Russia have been able to do in the past, including getting rid of chemical weapons, and including the way in which Russia has leverage over Assad, this is precisely what you would hope for. But given other regional developments and other events in the world, including Ukraine, there's a bit of a cold tension going on between the U.S. and Russia right now.
Let's talk about Iran's role, which up until now, some might argue, has been relatively low-key. What is Iran's role right now? Do they have forces on the ground?
Absolutely. Iran is probably the most important factor here. They had an Iranian general who was killed very recently. They've had Hezbollah, their proxy allies in the region, that have been combating. Without Iran, Assad would have already fallen by now. So therefore, Iran has the most to lose in this situation.
Well, do you think there are Iranian troops on the ground fighting right now?
That's always a complicated question of who's on the front line, who's not. There are clearly advisors. The fact that a general was killed in Syria makes me think that there are clearly forces there. But in terms of who's picking up the weapons and actually going out, clearly there are Iranians, but the scale of which Iranians versus Hezbollah, which mostly come from other factions, is difficult to tell.
Josh, talk to us about the concerns of, basically having this crowded sky over Syria. You've got the U.S.-led coalition. You've got the Russians involved. How concerned are you about a terrible misunderstanding?
I mean, this is the worst case scenario in some ways. It's one thing to have factions on the ground and terrorist attacks like we saw in Ankara over the weekend. It's even more complicated when you have U.S. warplanes and Russian warplanes seeing each other, and the possibility of a very small incident escalating out of control. And given the fact that they're not coordinating as much as we would like, even though they've had their rounds of talks, this is the kind of worst case nightmare scenario, because that type of conflict would lead to further conflict on the regional and domestic level as well.
You know, we talked about how Russia is complicating the situation, but some might argue the United States is complicating the matter. You know, they had this very expensive program to train and equip Syrian rebels. Even the administration would say it was a disaster. It did not work. And then this week, the U.S. sent 50 tons of ammunition to rebel groups trying to allegedly topple Assad. Who are these rebel groups, first of all? And what do you make of this?
I mean, I think just starting with the administration's policy, the fact that they've admitted it's a failure is actually a good step. It means that we're trying to figure out what our longer-term strategy is. The danger here is what happens if those American weapons are used against our own allies? What happens if Kurds begin to use that against Turks? That's a nightmare scenario for the U.S. as well. So I think it's very important for the U.S. to not only play a convening role of bringing all of our allies, and even people we disagree with, whether it's the Iranians or the Russians, to the table to understand that Syria in some way has to be settled. Otherwise, the refugee crisis, otherwise the civil war will not end, and there doesn't seem to be end in sight right now, unfortunately.
All right, Josh Walker, we appreciate your time. Thank you.